So I'm going to talk about an ensemble that I lead, and the ensemble is called Tactile, and Tactile comprises blind and sighted professional musicians who work together under blindfold. We perform either in darkened spaces or to blindfold audience, and our work is about really what happens when you take the visual out of music making intentionally. So I'm a composer and an improviser, and I've spent my working life, I guess, exploring that connection between improvised and composed music. This is Tactile, it's a rehearsal photo. So as you can, there's 6 of us. The sightings are the people wearing blindfolds. One of the things I quickly learned was that improvising without visual cues is really tricky, because it made me really appreciate how much I use my sight as an ensemble performer. So if you're improvising with people, there's a lot of visually looking to see if someone's coming to the end of what they're doing, looking to see someone breathe. There are moments where we might actually want things to kind of start up together, so there are those moments when you kind of make eye contact with someone and you know you're both going to totally go for it at the same time. So all of that is out of the equation, and it's just about what you can hear. And then one of the other aspects of our work is that we use tactile scores, so tactile non-braille scores. These are intended as a kind of a leveller, really, something that everyone will approach equally. I'm going to show you one of my original tactile scores. This is I think this is the first one I ever wrote. This is a failure, right? So what I imagined was that you would read this like a graphic score. So it's acrylic paint, very thickly laid onto card, and that someone would just read it like this. That's the top line. So there'd be some dots and blips, and that would kind of build in intensity, and then something that's more of a line, kind of quite expressive, kind of messy line here. And then you'd just go on to the second line and carry on. And there'd be another dotty, blippy bit, and then another line that's kind of more intense. But actually, it doesn't work like that. If you do this under blindfold, what I found was that people sort of did this and kind of lost it. And then you just don't comprehend the material in the same way. So meaning through touch is really not the same as meaning through sight. So eventually, I got onto this idea of a thread through the piece. So this is fishing line, and in fact in this one I've knotted the fishing line, and you can run your hand along and feel the knots, and it gives a kind of rhythmic sense of, it creates rhythm basically. So the importance of having a line that people follow through the piece just was one of the first things that I learned. So aspects of the practice, any cueing that we do with each other in improvising and in fact devising work, any cueing is going to be oral. So that has an impact on how the music sounds. So there are going to be cues. We kind of do it like, rhythmic cues or motivic cues that tell us something is about to happen. And also we use breath, and my personal favourite, which I'm not very good at, which is called directional sniffing. So some of the musicians in the band have just got this amazing sense of directional hearing, and can not only hear where the sound is coming from around them, but can also project a sniff in a certain direction, which I was never quite sure if they were winding me up and it was just some kind of joke that I wasn't quite in on, but actually musically that's kind of happened when we've been working together. And yeah, I think it does happen, but I'm just actually not very good at it. So all of our cueing is oral, and that does have a result. It's oral to us, it's also oral to our audience. And sometimes you would quite like things to happen without your audience kind of suspecting it's going to happen. There's something about the power of working under blindfolds, and everyone's in the dark, and sound kind of emerges from space, so that the mapping of sound from the ensemble in the space, like these kind of sonic energies emerging out of the darkness. It's kind of almost quite a visceral experience, and you're constantly aware of not just where the other musicians are, but how the sound is bouncing off the walls and how different surfaces affect the sound that you're creating. So there's a sense of the rehearsal space that we're in just through the sound. So the interaction within the ensemble, within the improvisation, we began sort of thinking about really listening for the intentions in somebody's improvising. So are they trying to push things forward? Are they kind of trying to intensify? Are they trying to pull back? Are they trying to clarify a position within the ensemble, a role? Are they playing a background supportive role? Are they moving towards the foreground? Are they trying to snatch the kind of foreground role? Are they wanting to duet with me? Are they wanting to kind of create a more sort of conflictual kind of dialogue? So really trying to hear the intensity in the intention rather in somebody's playing. Some of the challenges presented by work under blindfolds. This thing with form is that it's really hard to have cliff edges. So often in other improvising groups that I'm with, we'll build up and it's very easy to kind of cue a stop or cue a stop and then just get the flute player to play some low trills and then build up something else from there. So we can't have those sudden changes in form. You can't have the whole band coming in on tempo. I mean, you can count that in, but then the audience knows that you're counting in. So you can't just make that happen. You can't do what you would do in other chamber music situations where you might go and people kind of get a sense of tempo from a visual cue and then everyone can just start together. So we couldn't have cliff edges. What we did manage to do in this piece, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, we had moments when everybody came in with sort of very soft unison chords, and we did that sort of together. We tried to do it without any breath cues because we really didn't want anyone in the audience at all to sort of hear the breathing. So it was a sort of just a felt sense of knowing, really. And we practiced that a lot. Practiced that for nearly an hour, I think. Because memory is kind of challenged in this kind of work, things like complex unison melodies could be learned from one rehearsal to the other, record it, take it away, go and sit in the woodshed and learn this. But actually there was a kind of limit. There is a limit to how much time any of us have got to learn complex unison type material that has to be performed exactly. Okay. So any sort of learned unison stuff tends to be very, very short. And large scale structures. So I'm talking about improvisation, obviously, but it's also about yoking that to larger scale structures as well. Large scale structures are just really difficult because when we're building pieces together through improvisation in the dark, when you work in that way, what tends to happen is that the material is in a sort of constant state of flux and people will want to make changes, and actually tracking those changes is really, really difficult without anything. So in a sighted group, that sort of thing happens and you'll see people, I would typically jot down the changes. So I did this for a bit longer. Okay, we're going to go to a kind of drone section here, listen out for that clarinet solo, and then it's going to go into something more spiky. You might have all sorts of ways of mapping structure and understanding how that generates much larger scale forms. We found this really, really difficult to do because of the sort of changing content. So with all the memorised structures that Tactile have done, so not anything using tactile notation, anything that's entirely devised from sort of oral means and memory, tends to either be quite short or fall back on quite known structures. For example, we'll start with the drone section and then we'll have the tune or the head or something thematic, and then we'll have a solo from the guitarist, and then we'll have a solo from and they're actually kind of formally quite a bit Lego-like, and I wanted to sort of push our work beyond that into some some more sort of composedly ways of thinking about music, more sort of architectural ways of thinking about music. So it's a challenge not to kind of revert to idiom or known sort of frameworks. So Shoreline is one of my compositions. It was written in 2015, and it uses fishing wire, beads, feathers, and what's it called? Scouring pad. So kind of bendy wire. And the idea of this piece came to me when I was walking on a beach in northern France, and I was kind of picking up stuff off the beach, and I picked up some seagull feathers and a bit of string, a bit of sort of nylon rope, and some sort of tangled up fishing net. I'd like to say I picked up a bracelet or something with the beads, but I didn't, but they were just kind of added. So the idea is actual materials from a shoreline, and the piece also represents a particular location, a particular mood. With all of that material combined, I was able to take this piece to Tactile, and the piece it's all based around the fishing wire, and some of it uses knots in order to generate rhythm, as I was sort of demonstrating. But there are many different sections, and each member of the band is responsible for one section. So that person will kind of have a feel of the material, the score. They'll realise that onto their own instruments. And then the rest of the ensemble will respond to what that person does through improvisation. So this creates an architecture and a structure. It's distributed, the responsibility or the creativity in that resolution is distributed amongst the members of the band. And improvisation is still very, very much part of fleshing out and developing the piece. And again, that's a creative and collective act. So this score works in different ways, I think. Firstly, that's obviously not a seagull feather, it's a clean one, but if you ever sort of felt a seagull feather, they're a bit greasy and not that pleasant. So, clean materials. But actually, the choice of materials is meant to evoke a certain landscape and a certain place. It doesn't matter at all what a beach in northern France looks like, because actually this isn't about sight. But it does matter that, people have been there, they've got an idea of how it might sound, how it feels to walk on pebbles under your feet, and these kind of objects that help to sort of reignite tactile memories. So there's an imagined landscape, that's a kind of stimulus, a loose stimulus. We're creating a mood, drizzly rainy beach in France. And then these, I think, act as kind of provocations to stimulate in more detail the responses from the different musicians. So, and they work in different ways. I think different materials work in different ways. So with the feathers, it's quite a sort of intuitive, visceral response. It's like you feel this feather, I'm going to pass it round, and if anyone wants to feel and have a sense of like what that might sound like, and that's kind of up to you. What does a feather sound like? Maybe a feather could say way more about the kind of sound that I want than if I tried to notate it, in any method. So you've got feathers and they're quite visceral, and then you've got the knotted string, which is actually giving a form and a structure. Pass that around as well, in case you're feeling the need for structure. There we go. And then the beads mean something, so they're an agreed symbol. So the beads stand for unison chords, basically. So when the beads are close together, I want the chord to be a cluster, and when the beads are further apart, I want the chord to be kind of spread like this. So they're working in a really different way. They're kind of like symbolic. They stand for something in a way that, the visceral stuff and the actual feel of the knots on the wire work in a very, very different way with the imagination. And then there's a harmonic steer, which is a way of kind of containing the sound and steering it towards a sort of harmonic focus, I suppose, which is a sound field. So the sound field is the notes that we're going to use to realise. So those bits of tactile score will be mapped onto the sound field. So in other words, these are the notes that people will use when they're creating the gestures as a result of feeling a feather or whatever. It's actually a series of interlocked pentatonic scales. It sounds like this. And I've done a little realisation. We never recorded our main performance of this. It was dark. Our events producer was very sort of tied up with making the space dark. It's actually quite difficult to achieve, and didn't ever press record. So we don't have a recording of Shoreline, which is really annoying. But what I have done is I've produced just a little mock-up version of this, just as a solo vibraphone piece. So you'll hear the sort of my response to the wire wall, and then also the sort of dots emerging. So just to give you a bit of an idea of how that maps onto part of the sound field. If that was a tactile performance, there'd be, improvisation added to that from the rest of the band. Okay. I'm going to talk about this really quickly. Epistemology is how do we know what's happening in the dark? It's a really intense, it's built through sound, obviously, and it's also built through touch. Somehow you get to know people through sound as much as anything else. So obviously if you don't see someone, you get to know them through their voice and also the sound that they're making on their instruments. These are some of our audience feedback. So when we perform, there's a part one where we sort of get people playing games, balancing sticks between two people. We get them to create tactile scores using similar materials, and then the band will realise them. We get them to do exercises where they have to describe an object to a partner without looking at the object, so nobody can see the object, and it's about how you communicate this idea of overview, and how to communicate something to someone that can't see. You need to kind of really begin to talk a little bit structurally to really get that across. And then that sort of marries up with the second part, which is a performance in the dark. And these are some of the things that people have sort of fed back. In the first one, the experience of listening in the dark gave it a crackling, visceral quality, and that's palpable, I think, when you're there and you kind of feel the audience. And someone said that we were in a jazz bar and they didn't want to pick up their glass of wine because they didn't know where it was, because, we were dark, and, so it just felt really, was it okay to do this? Or, it was so silent that they really felt they needed to listen. So it sort of changed the feel of the space that we were in. Another one, project and performance one, which will heighten your sensory awareness. So, tactile sense will come into things, also your sense of balance, of vestibular sense, and your sense of mapping sound and the room. And it's the only way that you can gain knowledge of what's going on is through those other senses. I'm going to probably skip the interculturality aspect. just because, just because we're running out of time. But Tactile's built around blind and sighted people, and our work is very much about an exchange of material, exchange of ideas, differences in skills between blind and sighted musicians. But I guess what I wanted to come to was this sense of being intercultural and working in an intercultural space between people that can see and people that can't, who perceive the world very, very differently. And I was reminded of, Helen Sixu talks very poetically about living the orange. So self is an apple, the other is an orange. And actually to really be intercultural, to get to know that middle space in between you and a different other, you actually have to revisit the orange. Not just once, but many times in order to really go to that space and understand and stick with that. And so very much with Tactile, it's been about, for the sighted musicians, I think it's been a big learning curve actually, and it's been about sort of being very, very patient with our own lack of skill. It subverts the power relationship between sighted and blind, because actually the unsighted musicians, in a sense, have the greater skill level in terms of memorising music and mapping sound, and directional sniffing as well. So it really sort of subverts that kind of aspect to the power relationship. It's different again when we go out for lunch and, we can read what's on the menu, and if you're not sighted you can't, but there's a nice kind of symmetry to it, basically. There's an orange. So if we remove the visual, does it level the field, does it accentuate difference? We become very aware of those skill differences, and we're all wearing blindfolds. The intention was to level things out, but actually it becomes much more about embracing the difference and learning from the difference. And that last question, we talked a lot about different communities of learners, and I think one of the things that I've really learned about wearing a blindfold is what it might be like. So sort of a bit more empathy towards the unsighted community and how that is. And how if someone walks into a room and you've got a blindfold on for a whole rehearsal, someone walks into the room, you have absolutely no idea who that person is or what they're doing there. So, so much more has to just come from oral means, basically. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Jackie. It's a lot of food for thought there. Any questions from the crowd? Yes.
Just from a practical level, what you call the scores, the fishing line and everything, how, obviously you can't play and read the score at the same time, you need your hands, so there's a memorization process?
Yeah. That's it. So that's why it's distributed amongst the band. So the whole of Shoreline, thank you, lasts for, it's about 17 or 18 minutes, unpredictable because it's improvised, it's got that improvisation thing, but yes, that's the point. When people feel and then respond to that and then memorise it and then bring that to the rehearsal, basically, yeah.
Just a follow-up. That means you pass one score around. It's not that you replicate that for each player.
No, there's one score and it's distributed. So you've got one section, and you've got another section. Okay. Someone over here's got another section. So each person is then communicating that sonically. Yeah.
How does it change your work when you work without the blindfold later on?
So all the work with Tactile is blindfold work, but then if I'm working with other ensembles, I think it's made me realise that this is in its infancy, my work with Tactile actually, and it makes me realise there's a very rich field to be mined. I've just written another Tactile score for a sighted guitar quartet actually, so I'm going to sort of see how that goes with them. But it just makes me think that there's still more to discover about that relationship between the physical gesture your hand makes when you touch something actually, and then how that's embodied, and then how that affects the music and imagination. Yeah. So yeah, more to do.
Okay.
I was going to just say, have you been to the Dom and Noir restaurant?
Oh,
No, but I know of it. Yeah.
Because that's, yeah.
That was one of the things that got me thinking about the project actually. Yeah.
yeah, there was on the South Bank, there was a blind exhibition where you ended up having to eat in a completely blackened space.
Yeah.
And the people serving you were completely, had total ownership of the
Yeah.
space, but you had not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's it's just life changing, really.
Yeah.
That was fascinating. Thank you ever so much, Jack.